Have you ever wondered what it feels like to wake up in the pitch dark, strap on over 40 pounds of heavy gear, and march out knowing men are waiting to kill you? That was the daily reality for a Roman soldier. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. The history of the Roman legions is packed with massive battles that literally built our world. But we rarely stop to think about what it actually meant to stand right there on the front line. Imagine feeling the dirt shake under your boots as thousands of angry warriors march at you in perfect formation. How did the Romans actually fight? What did a normal guy feel in his gut the exact second his commander yelled the order to attack? In this video, you will see the complete experience. We will walk through the brutal training that turned regular farm boys into ultimate war machines, dive into the total chaos of hand-to-hand combat, and explore the dark moments that happened right after a victory. War in ancient Rome was far more brutal, highly technical, and deeply human than any movie has ever shown. But here is where it gets crazy. To truly understand how to survive a massive Roman battle, you have to go back long before the battlefield. You have to look at the process that took a totally normal kid, usually a poor farmer with zero fighting experience, and turned him into one of the deadliest warriors the ancient world ever knew. The life of a Roman soldier started with an incredibly tough selection process. A military writer named Vegetius, who lived in the 5th century, wrote one of the best military manuals of ancient times, called the Epitome Rei Militaris. In it, he spelled out exactly what Rome wanted from its recruits. The perfect candidate was between 16 and 18 years old, with a strong body, alert eyes, a wide chest, big shoulders, and powerful arms. But beyond physical strength, Rome looked for something harder to measure: the pure ability to obey orders under extreme pressure. Roman discipline was not just a strict rule pushed from the top down, it was a philosophy for collective survival. A soldier who disobeyed an order in battle did not just risk himself, he risked the entire group, broke the unit's teamwork, and could easily lose the whole fight. Now, you won't believe what they made them do next. Because teamwork was so vital, legion training did not start with swords and shields. It started with something that sounds basic, but was totally brutal: the march. New recruits were forced to walk 32 kilometers every single day, fully loaded with gear during their first months of training. This was not just an occasional workout, it was the foundation everything else was built on. Rome knew perfectly well that an army unable to reach the battlefield, rested and organized, was already losing before crossing any border. The weight they carried was absolutely insane. It included heavy metal armor, a huge shield, weapons, construction tools, 3 days of food, and personal items. The total often hit 40 kilograms or more. Gaius Marius, the famous general who reformed the army in the late 2nd century before Christ, made this heavy load such a massive part of their identity. His soldiers were actually nicknamed Marius's mules because of the absurd weight they hauled on the march. But this was not an insult among the men. The legionaries wore the name with absolute pride, using it as a mark of extreme physical toughness that set them apart from less trained fighters. Because of all this intense training, after just 1 year, a Roman soldier was physically stronger than almost anyone he would face on the battlefield. He was trained to use his weapons with deadly skill, and mentally prepared to hold his ground no matter how intense the pressure got. Rome didn't conquer the world by pure luck or accident. Their massive empire was built step by step on the backs of men who survived one of the strictest and most organized military training programs in human history. But here's the crazy part. A Roman battle didn't actually start when swords finally clashed. It started way before that, during the long days and weeks of heavy marching leading up to the fight. And honestly, it was during these brutal marches that a lot of soldiers started dying before they even laid eyes on a single enemy. If you're enjoying this deep dive so far, smash that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Whenever a legion got their marching orders, they moved instantly. The whole process was done with such perfect timing that anyone watching from the outside was completely blown away. Every single soldier knew exactly what gear he had to carry, his exact spot in the marching line, and his specific job when it was time to set up camp for the night. The Roman legions were so incredibly organized that an army of 50,000 men could arrive at a spot and be totally settled in under 3 hours. We're talking deep ditches dug, wooden walls built, and tents perfectly pitched. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. A normal daily march for these guys was anywhere from 24 to 32 kilometers. But if there was a massive emergency, they could push that to 45 kilometers in a single day, which is just an insane physical achievement. When you think about the heavy gear they wore and the terrible weather they marched through, it's mind-blowing. The Greek historian Polybius actually got to see the Roman army up close in the 2nd century, and he was amazed by how disciplined they were. He wrote that a Roman camp was basically a mini-city that popped up out of nowhere at sunset and vanished without a sound by morning. You really have to picture the massive weight a legionary carried to understand how tough they were. First, they wore heavy metal armor. Over time, this went from chainmail to the famous overlapping metal plates you always see in the movies. On top of that, the soldier carried his massive shield, which weighed between 6 and 10 kilograms all by itself. But wait, you won't believe what else they had to pack. They had their short sword, 2 heavy throwing spears, a backup dagger, a metal helmet, and enough food for 3 whole days. They also lugged around a heavy water flask, a pickaxe, a shovel, a thick wooden spike for building the camp wall, and their personal items. The grand total was often around 40 kilograms. That is actually more weight than a lot of modern soldiers carry into combat today. Because they were pushed to these absolute physical limits, sickness was just as deadly as the enemy army. Things like dysentery, swamp malaria, and all kinds of nasty infections wiped out more Roman soldiers throughout history than any enemy weapons ever could. To fight off those infections, the Romans had a medical secret that was basically magic. A military doctor named Dioscorides marched with the army in the 1st century, writing down exactly how they survived. He recorded their use of healing plants, burning wounds to stop bleeding, and strict camp hygiene. This made Roman field medicine light years better than any other army on earth. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. Now, their brilliance didn't stop at medicine. Even the way they walked down the road was a tactical masterpiece. The men on horseback rode at the very front of the marching line. They scouted the land, looked for sneaky ambush spots, and found the best paths. Next came the heavy infantry guards, the builders, and the pack animals carrying all the gear. Then came the main fighting force, marching 4 men across. Finally, the back of the line was guarded by more horsemen and light troops. Why do it this way? If they were suddenly attacked, the whole army could instantly snap into a deadly fighting formation, no matter what. But here is where things get really intense, so hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss out. When those front riders finally spotted the enemy, they sent back smoke signals or galloped back to spread the word. In a single heartbeat, the entire marching line transformed. Just seconds before, the men were walking in a heavy, steady silence. Now, you could see their hands shaking slightly as they checked their gear. They pulled tightly on their armor straps. They pulled their short swords in and out just to make sure the blade wouldn't get stuck. All the casual chatting completely vanished. The very rhythm of their marching footsteps shifted. The life of a Roman soldier was about to enter its absolute most terrifying and deadly phase. You probably think the fighting was the worst part, but you won't believe what the soldiers said. If you ask the veterans who survived, they all agreed on one thing. The absolute hardest part of the war wasn't the bloody combat, it was the agonizing hours right before the battle started. The waiting game was a twisted kind of psychological torture that most history books completely ignore. When two massive armies finally met on the field, they didn't just charge at each other. They usually spent hours just staring and getting into position. The generals would take their sweet time looking at the hills, guessing how many enemies there were, changing their battle plans over and talking to their advisors. And what did the regular soldiers do? They just stood there and waited. Now this is where it gets incredibly dark. Imagine standing there, staring at an enemy army just a few football fields away. They were close enough that you could see the sun shining off their armor, but far enough away that the killing hadn't started yet. Ancient writers like Polybius described what happened next with brutal honesty. The fear and adrenaline were so overwhelming that soldiers would literally throw up. Others would lose complete control of their bladders or bowels right there in the ranks, which is a totally normal human reaction to extreme terror. Many of them started praying frantically. They made desperate promises to their gods, especially Mars, the god of war, or Jupiter, or even the local gods from their hometowns. These intense, shared rituals right before the clash were the only thing holding their minds together. Which fact surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. Right before the clash, the commanding general or a military priest performed a blood sacrifice. They usually picked a bull with a specific coat color, or sometimes a pig. Then came the haruspices. These were special priests whose entire job was to read the future in the guts of the dead animal. They would inspect the entrails and shout the results to the waiting troops. If the signs looked good, the men's spirits lifted instantly. But here is where it gets interesting. If the signs were bad, veteran generals just did the ritual all over again. They kept sacrificing animals until they got the lucky answer needed to boost morale. Julius Caesar was famous for doing exactly this. He was very practical about religion and pulled this trick all the time without feeling guilty at all. During this wait, the men in the ranks checked their gear over and over. They didn't really need to tighten their straps again. They just needed to keep their hands busy. Doing some boring, repetitive task was much better psychologically than standing there alone with their dark thoughts. The Roman writer Livy tells us that older, battle-hardened veterans used this awful waiting period to calm down the terrified new recruits. The older men shared wild stories of past fights they had somehow survived. This passed-down tradition of bravery spread through the ranks like wildfire, building incredible group cohesion. If you love learning these hidden details of history, make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Then, the unavoidable moment finally arrived. The attack signal usually came from the horn players, called cornicents, who blasted loud musical codes across the battlefield. Or, the signal came from the sudden movement of the main legion standard. This was the famous eagle, a heavy symbol made of solid gold that every soldier viewed as deeply holy. Losing that golden eagle to the enemy was the ultimate disgrace. It was a massive, shared trauma that would literally take Rome decades to mentally recover from. You won't believe what happens next when we look at a real disaster. Back in the year 9 AD, during the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, Publius Quinctilius Varus lost 3 entire legions in a deadly trap hidden deep in the German woods. This bloodbath traumatized Rome to its absolute core. The shock was so bad that Emperor Augustus supposedly wandered his palace at night, crying out the words history will never forget. "Varus, give me back my legions!" Centuries later, that painful cry still echoes as the ultimate symbol of complete loss. But to really grasp what it felt like to survive a Roman battle, you have to understand their weapons and how they lined up. This setup is what made the Roman army the dominant military force for more than 500 years straight. Their gear and battle lines were the absolute peak of ancient military genius. It was a perfect mix of technology, psychology, and geometry. Enemy fighters from totally different cultures spent decades trying to figure out how to beat it, and most never managed to neutralize it. Now this is where it gets crazy. The famous Roman short sword, known as the gladius hispaniensis, completely goes against what you might think makes a weapon deadly. It only had a double-edged blade measuring around 45 to 55 centimeters. Next to the massive, meter-long swords swung by the Gallic, Germanic and Celtic warriors, the Roman sword looked visibly inadequate for combat. But that reduced length is exactly what made it so lethal in the specific, close-up fighting style the Romans had perfected over generations. When soldiers were packed tightly together, literally shoulder to shoulder and shield to shield, there was absolutely no room to swing a giant sword. Those big, sweeping cuts just wouldn't work. Instead, the short Roman sword was built for stabbing. A quick, hard thrust to the stomach, neck, or groin was almost always a guaranteed kill. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The Roman spear, known as the pilum, was a total game-changer. It had a 4-foot wooden handle attached to a long iron tip, making up half the weapon. Before hand-to-hand fighting started, soldiers threw these spears all at once from about 50 to 100 feet away. When this spear slammed into an enemy's shield, the iron rod bent on purpose thanks to its special metal. Because it bent, the spear got completely stuck. The enemy couldn't pull it out, and the awkward weight made their shield useless. They had to drop their shield, leaving them wide open for the charging Roman soldiers. But you won't believe how they used their own shields. Quick thing, make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. The massive Roman shield, called the scutum, was way more than just a defensive tool. Weighing up to 22 pounds and covering a soldier from knees to chin, this curved wood and metal shield was a brutal weapon. The soldier smashed the bottom edge into the enemy's feet to make them trip. Then they thrust the top edge upward to smash the nose or jaw. Finally, they used the whole shield like a battering ram, slamming the enemy to create a split-second opening where the short sword could strike. You've probably seen this next move in the movies. The famous Roman tortoise formation was used everywhere for very good reason. Soldiers on the outside raised their large shields to cover the front and sides. At the exact same time, the inside soldiers lifted their shields flat over everyone's heads. This created a solid, unbroken roof of wood and metal over the entire squad. The result was a slow-moving tank that was basically bulletproof against arrows, flying rocks, and any ranged weapons. But here's the crazy part. Flavius Arrianus, a Roman general from the 2nd century, recorded an amazing detail about how terrifying this was. Even the best trained war horses completely refused to charge at it. The steady, rhythmic sound of moving metal, combined with the look of a giant, unbreakable beast, terrified the animals to their core. The Romans were also masters of battlefield traps. The double envelopment is a famous move where soldiers on the outside edges run forward faster than the center, which holds back on purpose. This wraps the enemy in a deadly trap with no escape. But here is the disturbing historical irony. It was this exact move that Hannibal used with terrifying perfection against the Romans themselves. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal used this trick to hand Rome one of its worst defeats ever. In a single day of fighting, anywhere from 45 to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed. The Romans, traumatized and humiliated by that defeat, learned that exact trick. But here is where it gets interesting. They mastered its rules and decades later used it to crush their own enemies. The moment two armies crashed together was an intense experience that no modern movie or video game can ever truly capture. The soldiers who survived struggled to even describe what it felt like. And honestly, we do not have many stories from regular foot soldiers. Most writings we have today come from generals, politicians, and safe observers. But the few who fought in that first clash always used the exact same words. They talked about a deafening noise, suffocating heat, and a creepy feeling that time was warping, moving at weird, unpredictable speeds. But wait until you hear what happened right before that crash. The first move was a massive coordinated spear throw. Picture 8,000 men raising their arms at the exact same second, waiting for a signal and throwing their spears in one perfect wave. The sound of 16,000 spears slicing the air, followed by the smash into shields, armor, and bodies 30 meters away, was terrifying. Even the Romans themselves said that sound made their blood run cold, and they were the ones throwing them. For the unlucky guys on the receiving end, especially less disciplined armies, that massive cloud of spears falling from the sky could completely destroy their spirit and break their lines before the hand-to-hand fighting even started. If you are enjoying this, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you do not miss the next one. Now, after that spear throw came the most critical moment, the final charge. In those last few meters, the Roman soldiers sped up their pace in a careful, controlled way. They did not run wildly, because running would break their tight lines and ruin the group teamwork that made them so deadly. Instead, they moved forward with a scary, physical focus that totally messed with the enemy's mind. And then, the clash. Shield against shield, body against body, the whole line pushing forward like one giant living monster of metal and flesh. At that exact moment, all those years of hard training gave the Roman army a pure mechanical advantage over almost anyone who did not fight in a similar tight group. The pressure of the whole line working together was insane. With each soldier pushing against the shield of the guy right in front of him, they created a combined pushing force that was physically impossible to stop on your own. The historian Livy wrote about specific battles where the enemy line just backed up under the crushing weight of the mass, barely even swinging their swords. The Roman formation literally shoved their enemies right out of their spots, no matter how brave or strong every single enemy fighter was. But here is the crazy part. When that perfect formation finally broke and the battle turned into a bunch of smaller, messy fights, things shifted completely. This usually happened on rough ground or if a gap opened in the lines. Once it became a one-on-one fight, the individual training of the Roman soldier became the real key to winning. One-on-one, Roman soldiers were somehow still better than almost anyone they faced. And you will not believe this, but it was not because they were bigger or stronger. In fact, many of the warriors from Gaul and Germany were way taller and packed much more raw muscle than the average-sized Italian men who made up the core of the Roman legions. Instead, it all came down to pure technique and total mental control. Fighting with their short sword and heavy shield was an exact science. They would strike low at the thigh or belly. They would smash the top edge of their shield into a guy's chin or nose. Quick sidesteps caught an enemy's swing on the shield at an angle. Then a hard shield shove to create a split-second opening, followed by a quick stab to the neck or an exposed armpit. Over years of hard service, veteran Roman soldiers developed a highly specific mindset during battle. Today, experts call this the flow state. It was absolute focus on the present moment. Fear, tiredness, and even basic logic completely vanished. Their movements became totally automatic, driven by deep muscle memory. The few soldiers who actually wrote about this feeling described having broken, scattered memories. They talked about getting intense tunnel vision. They felt absolutely zero pain right in the moment, even when they took serious hits. It was an unsettling feeling, like their bodies were just doing the work like precise machines, without them even thinking about it. Now this is where it gets really interesting. What kept the whole legion moving together like one giant living creature in all that chaos? It was their unbreakable discipline. Right in the middle of a fight, the legion reacted instantly to horn blasts and the movement of their flags. And then you had the centurions. These were the tough officers in charge of 80 men each, and they were the true backbone of the Roman army. They constantly paced up and down the battle line. They shoved nervous soldiers back into their spots. They beat anyone who tried to run away with their famous wooden vine sticks. And they barked out orders with rough, raspy voices earned from decades of yelling on battlefields. A Roman centurion was a master fighter, a battlefield therapist, and a real-time crisis manager, all working in the most insane and unpredictable environment humans ever made. By the way, if you are enjoying these deep dives into history, make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. But here is a crazy fact that most people totally ignore when talking about these epic Roman battles. What actually happened to the guys who got hurt? Roman military medicine was incredibly advanced and organized for the ancient world, but it was also brutally limited compared to what we have today. That mix of high skill and bad tools meant the difference between life and death for thousands of men. The most common battle wounds were pretty predictable. Guys got deep cuts on their arms and legs, since those parts stuck out past the shield. They took brutal hits to the face and neck when their helmets got knocked loose by a hard smash or the crushing weight of the crowd. And then there were the deep stab wounds, usually to the chest or belly, which were almost always a death sentence. A good sword thrust to the gut killed a man slowly and in a horribly painful way. It caused massive infections that took days or even weeks to finally end his life. The records from back then describe this suffering in chilling detail. You won't believe how they handled this next part. The Roman army was actually the first military in the Western world to set up a real, organized medical system right on the battlefield. Every single legion had a dedicated team of special military doctors. Their main job was to patch up wounded guys as fast as possible so they could get right back into the fight. They did not do this out of the kindness of their hearts. It was just cold, hard military survival. Think about this for a second. A Roman soldier with a year of intense training was a massive investment of time, supplies, and money. Letting him die from a lack of care when he could technically be saved was a total waste. The Roman army calculated everything, so they systematically avoided this. The surgical tools dug up from ancient Roman sites will completely blow your mind. They show a level of skill that still amazes experts today. They had precision tweezers for removing fragments, thin probes to find weapons stuck deep in muscle, and scalpels of different sizes for specific surgeries. They even used urinary catheters and dilators. Some of these tools work almost exactly like the ones modern surgeons use right now. But here is where it gets really interesting. Pulling out arrowheads and broken spear tips was a huge speciality for Roman medics. We know this from a famous doctor named Galen. He patched up wounded gladiators in Pergamum before Emperor Marcus Aurelius called him to Rome. That intense job gave him more access to brutal combat trauma than almost anyone in history. By the way, if you're enjoying these crazy facts, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Now, getting treated back then was no joke. To stop severe bleeding, they would literally burn the wound shut with a red-hot iron. It caused extreme pain, but it totally worked on the battlefield. They also poured wine into wounds to clean them. They didn't understand germs yet, but they knew wine stopped the rot. To help with the agony during major surgeries, they gave soldiers herbal drinks made from opium and mandrake. They also made it a strict rule to wash out injuries with clean, running water. Even without knowing about bacteria, this simple habit saved massive numbers of lives by simply stopping secondary infections. You won't believe how advanced their hospitals were either. The Roman military hospital, called a valetudinarium, was a permanent building in their big camps. They were usually shaped like a massive U or a long rectangle, featuring private rooms for the wounded, carefully planned airflow, and wide central hallways so doctors could move quickly. When archaeologists dug up the fortress at Inchtethill in Scotland, built by the Legio Vigesima Valeria Victrix during Julius Agricola's campaign in Britannia, along with other sites in Germany, Hungary, and the Middle East, They were completely shocked. The layout and organization were way ahead of what was expected in that historical period. But wait until you hear the dark side of all this. Even with all this amazing medicine, they still hit brutal limits. If a soldier took a hit to the chest that punctured a lung, it was almost always fatal. They simply didn't have the tools to fix a collapsed lung. Deep bone infections, known as osteomyelitis, meant doctors had to chop off the limb, and even then, amputation had high death rates from shock or infection. On top of that, deadly blood infections, or septicemia, were a silent killer. They would cruelly wipe out soldiers who had survived the initial wound and actually thought they were recovering. Because of this, living with constant heavy pain was just a normal part of life for a career Roman soldier. A veteran's body was a living map of his long service. We're talking about overlapping scars, joints ruined from carrying heavy gear every day, and bones that broke and never healed right. These old injuries throbbed with deep pain during freezing, wet nights in northern Europe. The famous historian Sallust once wrote about an old general named Gaius Marius in his final years. He praised the general because his body was covered in the harsh, physical marks of endless combat. But here's the crazy part. That exact description perfectly fits any regular veteran of the Roman Empire, assuming they were lucky enough to survive to the rare age of 50. Now, this is where it gets interesting. After seeing what a Roman legionary actually went through, you'll never look at historical battles the same way again. Behind every single fancy map showing troop movements, and behind every cold number written in a history book, there were real, living men. These were guys who woke up way before the sun even came up, sick to their stomachs with absolute dread. They marched carrying nearly 90 pounds of gear, baking under the hot Mediterranean sun or shivering in the freezing German rain. They had to look right into the eyes of their enemies, and somehow, in a way they couldn't even explain later, they found the raw courage to keep stepping forward. What makes the Roman military so mind-blowing isn't just their clever tactics or their shiny weapons. It is the human element behind the entire massive operation. Rome basically took poor farmers, simple workers, and young guys who had zero hope for a better future and completely broke them down. Through brutal discipline, non-stop training, and a deep brotherhood built in the blood of battle, they turned these ordinary guys into the gears of a massive war machine. This was the exact machine that literally shaped Western civilization for hundreds of years to come. So, the next time you hear a story about the massive Roman Empire stretching all the way from Britain down to the Middle East, remember this. Every single mile of that giant empire was won by one specific guy who managed to survive one terrible day of fighting and then just kept on marching. That is the real, gritty truth of the Roman legions, and honestly, it hits way harder than any myth ever could. Which part of a Roman soldier's brutal daily reality shocked you the most? Was it the intense training, the terrifying field medicine, or the harsh reality of life after the fight? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. If this deep dive changed how you see these ancient warriors, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves history. Remember those terrified young men we talked about at the very beginning? They literally built the world we live in today.